Thank you very much. And now, continuing on our topic of the evolving threats, I am utmost glad, I must say, to welcome on stage Madame Clémence Poirier, Senior Cyberdefense Researcher at ETH Zurich. Needless to say, Clémence Poirier, you were expected because you are a familiar, reliable face of CYSAT and a trusted one. I must say, I recall all your intervention, the one on your analysis of the war in Ukraine from a cybersecurity perspective, that one of the Israel-Palestine conflict, and today you will be telling us more about cyber threat intelligence in space, and you will perform for us, we're really grateful, an annual threat landscape overview. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Margot. So I will provide you with a preliminary findings of an upcoming study that is a threat landscape for the year 2025 and cyber threat intelligence, CTI in general. So it will be published in about 2 months. Before I dive into all the attacks that I could find against the space sector in 2025, I'm a researcher, so I like to go a bit into the methodology and how do we count attacks against the space sector. And if you're an executive here and maybe there's a cybersecurity incident or you need to be briefed about this topic, usually you have 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to be briefed about the topic. And you don't really have time to have a super detailed explanation of everything. And usually when the cybersecurity guy tells you like, really, cybersecurity is really important, it's becoming a problem, we need to put budget, we need to do something, you're gonna ask, okay, how many attacks against our company? How many attacks against the space sector in general? And the truth is, you're not really going to find an exact number. We don't really have a comprehensive database of all attacks, all cyber attacks against the space sector. And there's a lot of reasons for that, and I will provide you some explanations. But we do have some numbers. They are very different, but they can tell you a bit of information about what the threat landscape is like. So, for example, in 2020, NASA, they said that they suffered from 1,785 incidents, including equipment loss and theft. So that's quite a lot. Of course, they don't provide any kind of detailed explanation of each attack. We don't know what were the threat vectors, who is attacking who, the segment targeted. We don't really know. We just have like a gross number. ISRO, same. They said they face 100 cyber attacks per day. So that's a very different kind of number. Same, they don't provide any details, but that kind of gives you an idea of what the threat landscape is like. In 2024, CYSAT, they said that they monitor 100 attacks per week on average. So that's also quite a lot and gives you a kind of idea of what the threat landscape is like. But again, you don't really have a detailed explanation. A guy from Thales created a blog and tried to do a bit of a database of incidents against the space sector and mapped 70 attacks between 1977 and 2019. ENISA, last year, they released a threat landscape report and they mapped 76 attacks against the space sector between 1977 and 2023. And Cyber Inflight, this is a company, they have a booth today here, so check them out, they're doing cool stuff. They mapped 599 cyber attacks against the space sector between 1977 and 2024. So it's not that any of these numbers are right or wrong, they're all correct, but they just use different methodologies, different ways to count, and they have different access to data. So why is that? There's a lot of reasons for that. And one way to explain it is a White House report from last year, which said that information about space cyber threat is inconsistent, untimely, not actionable, lacking context, and in some cases, overclassified. So it gives you a bit an idea of why we don't really have a lot of information about real-life incidents against the space sector. And you add to this a lot of methodological issues and dilemmas. First, how do you define the actual boundaries of the space sector? This is an issue we have when it comes to calculating the value of the space economy. For cyber attacks, that's the same. So here, quite an interesting example that I wanted to show you. This is a ransomware claim from a threat actor called CYSAT against Simon Guyanais. Not a space company at all. This is just a construction company. But in their claims, the threat actors, they said, oh, this is a company that has a contract with the European Space Agency because they do the concrete of the launch pad in Kourou. Do you count this as an attack against the space sector or not? It still says something about the threat landscape because obviously CYSAT seemed to be quite interested that this company has a contract with ESA. So, but still not a space company. And you have a lot of dilemmas like this, like US Geological Survey, this is remote sensing, but also other sources of data. Do you count it as an attack against the space sector or not? Same for aerospace companies, Boeing, Airbus. Do you count all attacks against Boeing? Sometimes the threat actors is after information about the aviation sector, sometimes about space. So how do you count? You don't always have all the details. Same for aerospace and defense giants. Companies like Rheinmetall here, you have a claim, but also Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, they do space, they do defense, they do aviation. And in some cases, you even have threat actors that are looking to find information about weapon systems, but then they're surprised to find information about the company's cooperation with NASA, because they didn't even know that that defense company is also doing space. So when you count attacks for an entire year, if you apply different methodologies, at the end of the year, it compounds. You have radically different numbers. So it has an impact. Another challenge on the way to count cyber attacks against the space sector is if you have a cyber attacks that disable 20 GNSS receivers, do you count it as 20 attacks or one campaign that has as an impact disabling 20 GNSS receivers? And it might seem like nothing, and like really the nerdy methodological issues, but your database can have radically different numbers at the end depending on how you count. Then you need to also understand how cyber threat intelligence economics work. There is real activity, observed activity, and published activity. Real activity is the actual volume of all cyber operations targeting space systems, whatever the segment. And this number, we don't have it. Nobody has it. It's not really gathered. There's not like a single entity that has sensors everywhere to map all attacks around the world against the space sector. Not even the NSA has that. So we don't really have an actual picture of what the threat landscape is. But cybersecurity companies, of course, they have customers, they have sensors, they observe the network of their customers, they see what kind of cyber attacks they face, who is targeting them, and so that's what is observed activity. And there's two issues for the space sector. First, cybersecurity companies, usually they don't really have dedicated products or expertise in space, so they don't really have sensors to monitor everything, and especially on board. There's not so many cybersecurity solutions for onboard detection in cybersecurity companies like Mandiant, Microsoft, and the likes. So it leads a bit to a sort of omniscience fallacy. Like analysts, they get a huge amount of data from their sensors and customers, and they think that this is the actual threat landscape because there's so much data. But actually, it's just a subset coming from their customers. And then you have published activity. So at the end, observed activity, not everything is published in Threat Landscape Report. And if you're interested in real-life incidents, probably you try to look into reports that are published about the threat landscape in the space sector, and you probably couldn't find a lot. Because usually, cybersecurity companies, if they publish a threat landscape report, it's because they have a solution, a cybersecurity product that they can sell. to face the attack that they're gonna recount. And the space sector is such a small sector, niche sector, and very specific that there's not really incentive to publish threat landscape reports and detailed recount of real-life incidents against the space sector. So that's why you don't really have so many examples of the threat landscape. And of course, the CTI sector is super fragmented. So if you look at US cybersecurity company, it's really geared towards like China, Russia, Iran, because their customers perceive these threat actors as adversaries. Obviously, you're not gonna publish about the cyber offensive operations of your customers. And that's the same in the US, but also in China and Russia. They do not publish about the offensive operations of their own customers. So it creates a lot of biases in the kind of information about the threat landscape that you have. Another issue is that if you're a cybersecurity specialist, you receive a ton of data about cyber threats. Maybe you're on a CTI platform, you're in a SOC or something, and you cannot look at everything. So you have to filter to see what's relevant for your mission. But the problem is that space is not really considered as a standalone sector. Space is not a standalone sector. It's present across different variables. So for example, if you have attacks against Boeing or Airbus, maybe it's about space, but maybe it's going to be tagged about as an attack against the aviation sector. If you have an aerospace and defense giant that is being attacked, maybe it's going to be put in the defense sector. If you have a European Space Center that is doing research, it's going to be maybe tagged in science. If you have attacks against GPS trackers, fleet monitoring from automotive companies and so on, maybe you have attacks against GNSS systems, but maybe they're going to be categorized in the transport sector. If you have attacks against Earth observation satellites, maybe it's going to be tagged in the environment sector. If it's SATCOM, maybe it's going to be the telecom sector. And depending on the filters you put in your SOC or CTI platforms, you're going to get maybe only a partial view of the threat landscape. And maybe you're going to miss relevant examples of incidents for your mission, and then you're going to miss some potential cybersecurity control that you could implement. Another thing that is preventing having a real comprehensive database is how you monitor. And in the past few months, there were a lot of cat and mouse game between threat actors and law enforcement. And you probably saw that a lot of underground forums, cybercriminal forums were taken down in the past months. So while it's very positive to prevent and disturb the action of threat actors, when you're on the monitoring side, it means that the threat actors, it's really hard to keep up about where they're going. So maybe you're missing some claims of the attacks they make because suddenly their underground forum of choice is being deleted. So they move to something more private. They move to the dark web. They move to another platform. They're switching their channel to private. So when you monitor also a lot of threat actors on Telegram, when Pavel Durov was arrested, millions of channels from threat actors, millions, were deleted. And so then these groups, either they switched directly their channel to private, they only created closed-door channels, or they switch platforms. So when you're monitoring, you have to find a new account. Maybe they have a new username. You have to find out who is who. And so when you're monitoring, it creates disruption, and you might miss some attacks and then have lower number than usual. And so now even you have here an example of threat actors that are targeting the space sector. They even put in their bio, like, we don't violate the rules of Telegram, please do not take us down, because that's happening. So the time channels are staying online is super short now. Sometimes it's just a few days, just a few weeks. So if you're not monitoring constantly, you're missing claims of attacks against the space sector. Another issue is also vulnerability laws. So for example, in China in 2021, they passed a law that basically ask security researchers that find vulnerabilities in software or hardware to disclose the vulnerabilities that they find to the Chinese government. So, and essentially the law also prevents them from disclosing vulnerabilities that they found to vendors. So usually security researchers, they do this as part of bug bounty program, pen testing, and so on. They cannot really do that anymore. And because the government is aware of those vulnerabilities before they're reported, they could use that for offensive purposes. And so if you're an IT company, which is usually where most of the cyber attacks against the space sector originate from, then you also have a biased view of the threat landscape. And there's a similar law that is only a draft at the moment that is being discussed in Russia. So I don't think it probably is going to pass because there's a lot of pushback against it, but that's something that might come up in other countries as well. Another issue is timing. So here I took examples from 2 studies that I did, so I applied this exact same methodology, but I found different numbers. I did one study on cyber attacks against the space sector in the war in Ukraine, and I found 124 attacks. And then I did another study on attacks against the space sector in the Gaza war, and I found 237 attacks. Do I really think that there were more attacks against the space sector in the Gaza war than the war in Ukraine? Actually not. I think there were probably more attacks against the space sector in the war in Ukraine. But the fundamental difference in my methodology was that on the Ukraine study, I did a lot of backward mapping. I went back in time to find real incidents on primary sources, whereas for the Gaza war, I was monitoring every day as things went, so I found more attacks. So that's also a kind of a bias that you have to be aware from when you hear numbers. Then there's also recency bias. So you remember when there was the Wagner coup in 2023 and Wagner was marching towards Moscow? There was a cyber attack against the satellite network at that point. And a mysterious channel called Richard V for Wagner claimed an attack against Dozor Teleport. This is a Russian SATCOM company, and claimed to have disabled user terminals, access the IT environment of that company. They leaked a lot of data about user terminals from the company that were located in Ukraine, belonging to the FSB and the Ministry of Defense. And everyone was at the beginning a bit suspicious about this claim because none of the Wagner communities online really reshared this claim. They didn't follow this account. There was not really any obvious link between Wagner and this group. So there were some suspicions that maybe it's not really from Wagner, but no official information. And then in 2025, 1.5 years later, there is new information, and the Ukrainian Cyber Alliance, a Ukrainian group, claimed that they were behind the attack all along and that they pretended that the attack was from Wagner. So that means that when you count attacks against the space sector, you also have to keep up to date about old examples and old incidents, because then you also have a different vision of the threat landscape and who is attacking who. So it creates additional monitoring work, and that's also important to realize when you look at threat landscape reports. And finally, all the screenshots are claims of attacks against space systems and space companies. How do you verify attacks? How do you differentiate what is true information and what is fake? And there's a lot of interest in targeting the space sector among threat actors, but also a lot of fake claims. So sometimes, because companies, they don't really want to share information about cybersecurity incidents that they face, and rightfully so, it's really difficult to assess what really happened and what did not. But still, when you have a lot of fake claims, it still says something about the threat landscape. It tells you that threat actors, they're interested in space. And actually, when you look at primary sources, you actually see that threat actors, they're super interested in space, and not like in any other sector. They share news about space. They share fun facts about space. They share how space systems are used in armed conflict. They share what are the best satellite hacking tools. So this is something that they are interested in, and you don't see similar stuff about automotive or even aviation. So that's something to take into account. So now I'm coming to the actual threat landscape and what I found for 2025. So I found 407 cyber attacks against the space sector that occurred in 2025. This is open source data only, so there's probably way more. But with open source data and where you have actually quite some information about each incident, that's the number I found. When you look at the timeline throughout the year, you see that there's a strong correlation between events and geopolitical events and conflicts and cyber attacks and claims of cyber attacks against the space sector. So when there was, in the beginning of the year, the Trump-Zelensky meeting in the White House, there was like a peak of cyber attacks against the space sector at that moment. Probably way more than I could monitor here, but that was a steady increase. Then, during the negotiations and escalation regarding tariffs between the US and China, there was also an increase of cyber attacks against the space sector. Then, in May, there was the Indian-Pakistan crisis. It lasted 3 days, and I could find 3 examples of claims against the space sector at that moment. And this crisis had nothing to do with space. So you see that now, each time there's a geopolitical crisis, each time there's an armed conflict, you have attacks against the space sector. And it doesn't matter that your company is fully civilian, is completely unrelated to the conflict, not in that geographical area and so on, you're gonna be targeted. So you have to update your threat model. And then there was a huge peak during the Iran-Israel war in June 2025 with a lot of attacks from activist groups and state actors. Then it sharply decreased. Probably hackers, they take vacations as well. And then in October, there was less attacks. There was the Gaza peace plans at that moment. I don't know if it's related or not, but that's what happened at that moment. And then when Trump got elected and protests in Iran increased in December, attacks increased again, and it continues increasing with the current war in Iran. Then some statistics. So it's really important to understand that most cyber attacks, they don't target the satellite in orbit. They target mostly the IT environment of space companies and entities. They target the user segment and the ground segment. And when it comes to the type of attacks, it's mostly DDoS. Now this is like the constant background noise that we have. They are here all the time. There's a lot of ransomware. There was really a strong increase of ransomware attacks, especially on supply chain actors, and a lot of data breaches and data leaks. When it comes to the most targeted companies were Elbit Systems and Rafael, Israeli space companies, and Tonov. This is the company that transports satellite and rockets between manufacturing sites and to launch pads. They're constantly targeted as well. NASA, always targeted. Threat actors, they're super keen into hacking NASA. The Ukrainian Space Agency, Israel Aerospace Industry, Arsenal, this is also a Ukrainian Space Agency. So the list goes on, and you see that it's quite correlated to armed conflicts, but also it's widespread all across the world, and it's companies, but also space agencies. One thing that I also noticed that was quite interesting this year, last year, was that I could find 17 data leaks, 22 data breaches, and 14 data sales. And usually threat actors, they leak data samples, a few screenshots, a few documents to show that they really did it and it's not fake. And in all of these samples, or when they really actually leaked data, you always see data about other space companies. So even if you did everything great when it comes to cybersecurity and data security, sometimes your data might be leaked because your partners or customers had a cybersecurity incident. And there were a lot of incidents. So first, the amount of data is quite high, but also each time you had information about other space companies that were leaked. So like, for example, Navi Technology was breached and it released information about Inmarsat. or ESA was breached, and it released information about SpaceX and Airbus. So that's really an issue, and sometimes as a company you don't always have visibility because this is not your telemetry. So you might not be aware that some of your data, which might be confidential, is out there on the dark web. Now, an interesting example that happened last year that I want to talk to you about is that the South African Weather Service was hit by ransomware. And this is a group that is well known, Ransom Hub. They sent a phishing email or some kind of social engineering to a staff at the Weather Service. It enabled the deployment of a ransomware. All their data was corrupted. The data products they had in development was lost. The message handling system was destroyed. The website was unavailable for days. Some part of the website was even available for months. Weather data was completely unavailable for 25 days, and then for months only at reduced capacity. So that was quite a challenge. It even led the service to basically share extrapolate data. So essentially fake weather data. So that means that when you open your phone and you check the weather app, this is not true data. So you might think, okay, this is not so critical, but think about how many decisions are made every day based on the weather. In agriculture, in aviation, in your leisure. That's quite critical. And this incident was really a wake-up call for the Weather Service when they were audited by the parliament. That's really what they said. It also impacted their bottom line. It's a government service, but they still have a budget and so on, so it kind of exploded their budget. So that's really an example that shows that ransomware are really critical, and here it didn't really affect satellites in orbit, but all the weather stations that are positions in Antarctica, the Indian Oceans, and the Southern Atlantic Oceans were disabled, and they could not connect to their database. So that was the impact of that incident. Another interesting example, it's from an anti-Iranian group. They targeted 2 Iranian shipping companies and disabled their SATCOM. And we don't really know what was the attack vector, but they managed to breach Fanava Group. That's the SATCOM provider of these 2 shipping companies, and the SATCOM is used on vessels. They managed to get admin rights. We don't really know how, but still. And they completely destroyed and disable all the satellite modems of 116 vessels that are transporting oil between Iran to China. And if that was not enough, there was actually more data released from anti-Iranian groups, and they were storing all their password in plain text, and the password was like the name of the ship and some additional character. And basically with the data that they were storing in plain text, any hacker could basically listen to all communications. So that was a critical attack, and the attack was not a wiper malware, but it had the kind of similar effect because it completely erased the storage chips on all the modems. So basically, you could not repair the cyber attack with a software update. You basically had to replace each modem on each ship. So it really creates financial burden. I'm running out of time, so I'm switching this one. Then final thing, threat that I wanted to talk about, and that is really becoming a problem, and this is this threat attacks against space personnel. The staff of space companies and agencies is really becoming a target. And here you have a few examples. Stark Aerospace, they were hit by ransomware, and they leaked employees' passports. Tupolev, this is a Russian aviation company, but one cyber attack unveiled the SATCOM systems of their planes, and data about their staff was also breached. Pulsar, which is now called Navi Technology, was breached, and data about their staff was breached. GLAT, they were a attacked as well, and the threat actors released on Telegram pictures of the staff and office space. The Pakistani Institute of Space Technology, they were breached, and staff from data from the staff was retrieved, and their ID numbers was also released online. So that's becoming really an issue, and this is just a few examples. And finally, staff is the new target, but it's also the new threat actor. And we see an increase in insider threats. So last year, a lot of North Korean IT workers tried to get hired in space companies for financial motives, but also to retrieve confidential data about space systems. There was also a case of a Russian cosmonaut that took pictures of SpaceX systems during a training missions before going to the ISS, and that was in violation of ITAR. And there was also a case where a French intelligence officer left the service and then joined a German space companies and shared classified documents. So that's, again, also a few examples of current threats. So that's it for me. If you have any questions, I'm happy to answer.
Thank you very much, Clémence. Indeed, the time is out, but we can't let you go right now. We have one question from the audience that echoed one I had too. So you've explained very well, and thank you for this comprehensive review and those methodological questions you raised and asked. We see that when it comes to threat and assessing threat and counting threats, it's all about claims and reputational issues, because threat actors have an interest to show and to display the threat they are, while private actors, national ones, might be interested in, well, withholding some of those information. And when it comes to your methodology and the one you used and you would recommend to use to count threats, we have a question from Regis Temperman, who asked more than exact number. Could a trend be more representative as well as financial impacts? And, well, the broad question is, how should we consider a threat a threat?
Yeah, I wouldn't say there really is one methodology that we should implement. The thing is to be clear and explicit about the methodology that you use, so that when you look at numbers, you know what it is and what it isn't. And that, I think, is important. And this is the same for when you calculate the value of the space economy. When it comes to the most likely threats and what type of attacks we should focus on and so on, I know a lot of agencies are doing this work, and it's great. But it really depends who you are. There's not like a one-size-fits-all. You have to adapt based on what kind of company you are, where do you have business, who are your customers. We've said it multiple times in this conference. You inherit from the threat model of your customers, so you're not in the same situation if you're fully civilian, or if you provide services to belligerents in armed conflicts. So you have to adapt this. Cybersecurity was long overlooked in the space sector. Now it's really changing. We see that it's acknowledged. We see that you have heads of agencies that come to this conference and so on. So that was not the case at the beginning. So we see that now it's really considered as something important. There is budget for that and so on. So you just have to focus on. And I think the next presentation will also give some insights about real-life incidents and where we need to focus next.
Thank you very much. And maybe perhaps one last question about reporting requirements. You've explained how sometimes the initiatives of Russia and China to have to keep track on what is a threat exactly is important, but it comes with side effects. What would be your take on that, reporting requirements?
Yeah, that's also a bit of like a dilemma again, because you might, I think it's really important when you have reporting requirements if you're facing an incident and the law requires you to notify the cybersecurity agency or some kind of authority. But also we saw it with kind of like attacks like Salt Typhoon or so on, where the law enforcement themselves are being hacked, and then by looking at if you are able to breach the entity that receives all the reports, then if you're an intelligence agency, you might know if you're being detected or not. So that's also an issue that you have to take into account.
Thank you very much, Clémence Poirier. A warm round of applause for you.